Yes. Okay, so the first part of the 3-part assignment I just handed you is a color wheel. So you're going to paint your own color wheel, and I'm going to do a demo on this because I have some templates you can use, and I'm going to also show you how to mix color effectively. So obviously this is a color wheel. I have a smaller one, maybe that'll work better. The color wheel has the 12 hues. Oftentimes the word hue and color are used interchangeably. I use them as so interchangeably often. However, just to be clear here, there's 12 hues. And so red is a hue, for instance, right? Red is also called a color, but a lot of times, for instance, when you go to like Lowe's or Home Depot and you try to pick out paint swatches, you'll see things like bubblegum pink, right? That's a color, that's not a hue. The hue for pink is red because pink is a tint of the hue red, right? So the purple, what you often call purple on the color wheel, is called violet. That's the name of the hue. So you're going to be painting all 12 of these using only the primary colors. The primaries are yellow, blue, and red, and those should be easy enough to paint from that set of acrylics that you all have, right? Then after that, you're painting your secondaries, which are orange, green, and violet. So orange is a combination of red and yellow. Green is a combination of yellow and blue. And violet is a combination of red and blue. And then you have your tertiaries, which are your red violet, your blue violet, your yellow green, your yellow orange, and your red orange. So one thing that you want to do when you're painting, for instance, is mix up enough paint to kind of strategically be able to paint the primaries, secondaries, and tertiaries. And what I mean by this is, if you mix up an orange, you might as well then paint your orange, mix up some more yellow into it and paint your yellow orange, then mix some red into it to paint your red orange, right? So you're kind of trying to make this strategic and make it work for you in terms of the time you invest in it. I will tell you that the red violet and the blue green are often the most difficult colors to mix, and what you will need for those is a little bit of white. So you will mix up something that's very close to this and then gradually add white, so that your task in this assignment is to make your 12 hues match these exactly. So I understand that there's a lot of greens out there, but what I'm looking for is this green. I do have a couple color wheels for you over here so you can mix and then match your colors. However, your textbook also contains a color wheel, so I would really like it if the color wheel stayed in here. I use the color wheel all the time still in my own practice. I use a ton of color in my work, and this is still a super valuable tool to me. So if you want to purchase one, they're pretty cheap and they're very, very useful. So the way that I use it often is, I just like to have it there so that I can kind of make decisions without having to think much while I'm working. Whenever I mix a color, for instance, I like to use like a really fiery red a lot. I will also mix the complement to that color. So for instance, let's say my fiery red is a red orange. I'll also mix a blue green. So colors that are opposite one another on the color wheel are called complements. And the complements have a very complicated relationship that is essential to understanding color theory. So when I mix a little bit of a blue-green into my red-orange, it doesn't really change the hue. It just makes my red-orange a bit more complex. Now, if I were to mix equal amounts of red-orange and blue-green, what I would get is a neutral. Most of the time that means a kind of gross brown. If you have really well pigmented paint though, mixing complements will yield a really nice gray. But like I said, with student grade products, you're pretty much looking at a brown if you mix the complements in equal value. But mixing a little bit of the complement into whatever color you're using doesn't change the hue, it just makes it a bit more complex. So for instance, if I add a little bit of blue to my red orange, it's just going to take the temperature of that red orange down a bit. It's just going to subdue it a little bit, not a lot, just a little bit. So that relationship between the complements is really important. But the color wheel also shows you, like for instance, if you add red to your yellow orange, you're going to get this, right? It's really useful for me for yellow, because yellow is kind of a difficult color to negotiate because it's so light in its value as a color that anytime you add anything to it, you're pretty much changing the hue of it. The back of the color wheel allows you to see what happens with tints, tones, and shades. So tints are color plus white, tones are color plus gray, shades are color plus black. So tints, tones, shades are really, really important. So what happens when you mix, you know, this and that? This color wheel also shows you, kind of points out with arrows the complements, but it also shows you several different color schemes. So the complementary color scheme, triadic color scheme, and these are all helpful when you actually sit down to make your own paintings, the color schemes, because sometimes triad really creates a lot of unity in a composition, whereas if you use two complementary colors next to one another in a composition, they're going to create a lot of vibrancy, they're going to vibrate together, whereas if you mix them, they neutralize one another. So this, all to say that I use my color wheel a lot still, right? I often find it like stuffed in the pockets of my work clothes, and I'll take it out like, yes, it's here, I can start working. So this is a really useful tool. Now for our purposes, if you look at your assignment sheet, it says that your first task is to lightly draw 2 concentric circles on illustration board and equally divide the spaces between the circles into 12 segments. I have tried to make this much easier for you. So we are not using illustration board, we're using Bristol paper, we're just gonna go with that. And you can, if you're in class, you can cut the Bristol paper to 8 by 8, which is gonna be the size of the color wheel. But if you're at home, what you can do is just trace this, because I gave you this template if you're at home. You can trace this onto a larger piece of Bristol, complete the project that way, and then bring it to class and we'll cut it. But for those of you in class, you're going to cut your Bristol to 8 by 8, and then you're just gonna trace this color wheel template onto there. So you don't have to like measure or anything, you can just trace this. And there's your color wheel template. And again, these templates, they really need to stay in the classroom. So this color wheel is due at the beginning of next class, and I would like you to just do this tracing before you leave today. So this is the general shape of your color wheel. Now you need to paint color swatches that you will then cut out and paste onto the color wheel. So this is my blue from the last class, it's dry now. So you want your color swatches to be at least large enough to fit this shape, because this is the shape of each of the colors on the color wheel. So you just need the swatch to be at least this big. So when you're ready to start painting, you're also going to paint on Bristol paper. And first you're obviously going to mix your colors, with the exception of the primaries, which just come out of the tube, right? So one thing I discovered in my other classes is that some of you in these Chromacryl sets of 5 will not have a cool blue, you will have a warm blue. This makes some of the color mixing a bit more complex, especially in the purple spectrum, which really surprised me because a warm blue should be able to mix a purple or violet much better than a cool blue, but somehow it doesn't. So I have a full tube of this here. If you have a warm blue. Again, it's very rare. I don't know why it happened, but some people did have it. Okay, so what you need obviously are your paints. I really love these for mixing. These are palette knives, but if you're at home, what's really good for color mixing is a spatula. These are also great. Or plastic knives, plastic spoons, all of those things work. I urge you not to mix with brushes because it's kind of a bad habit. What happens often is if you mix with a brush, right? Let's say I'm mixing yellow and blue to make a green. A lot of times the yellow will get stuck down here in the brush, and then when you go to try to paint, you're getting a surprise. You're not getting a green, you're getting a streaky green with yellow in it. So mix with something other than your brushes. I know that a lot of you have painted before, and when using acrylic you will have a container of water and you're going to dip your brush in there to clean it. I really highly urge against that. I like in that Layla Ali video, one color, one brush. And I'm not saying that you need 12 different brushes, but what I am saying is paint your color, wash this out really, really well, and then switch colors. Don't do this thing where you're dipping into water that's like nasty and murky and thinking it's not going to affect your color. So if that's what you do in your own practice, that's perfectly fine. But here, one color, one brush, clean it out really well, and then move on to the next color. These are excellent brushes for these. These are perfect. This is kind of a soft hair brush, and it's flat, and it's just large enough for me to be able to paint this effectively. When you're ready to mix color, you can either do it on a paper plate or any plate whatsoever, but you can also do it on one of these palettes. And if this were my project, I would make sure that they're clean before I get started, but this side seems fine. So I'm gonna start by showing you the technique used to paint the swatches. So I don't have a Chromacryl yellow, I'm just gonna use this. Many of you don't have the Chromacryl brand of acrylic, and that's fine, but that means that you probably will spend a little bit more time mixing colors, right? So this does not look like a yellow up there, but it is a yellow. So when you're ready to paint your swatches, what you want to do is take your flat brush, dip it in the color, and then paint as flat and neat of a swatch as possible. So here, this is not about expressive painting where you get a lot of texture down. This is about trying to get it as flat as humanly possible. So first you go over it a couple times, and then you can't quite see the brush strokes that well with yellow, but they are there, and I'm trying to flatten them out. So my last few passes with the brush are just going to be very, very light, like I'm barely touching the paint now, and that's going to help me get rid of some of those brush strokes. So again, now if I were switching to a green, I would wash this out, but I'm just going to use a second brush for the purposes of keeping this demo going. So now, in order to mix a green, I need my blue. And the idea always, always, always is to mix a little bit of your darker color into your lighter color, and just very gradually. And this is what the palette knife is great for, or a spatula, or anything that you have laying around in your kitchen. This really makes sure that your color mixing is precise and that you don't have any kind of surprises left in your brush of whatever the other, whatever colors you're mixing together. So I do have some palette knives for you up here. Again, I'd appreciate if they stayed in the room, and they are pretty affordable to buy. If you're ever gonna paint again, they are a must. So I have a green, right? But is it the green I need? That's what I need to determine before painting it. So again, I'm taking out the color wheel and trying to match it. Now what's going to happen is you may match it perfectly now. So there's the green, and I can just take a bit of this and I can go like this. And I think it needs a bit more blue there, so I'm going to gradually mix that blue, and I'm going to get rid of that with just my finger, right? So I think it just needs a bit more blue. Now what's going to happen a lot is that you're gonna mix a color and it's gonna match perfectly on the color to the color on the color wheel or the hue on the color wheel. And then you're gonna paint it. Once it dries, it's gonna be a bit darker than you anticipated. That's very typical, and that's okay. I'm okay with it being just slightly darker. I am, however, not okay with it being a totally different hue than what's on the color wheel. So you wanna match it as closely as possible in wet paint, and then once it dries, it may turn just a bit darker. I think that's pretty okay. So then I'm gonna paint this, again, in as flat of a manner as possible. And I'm using a different brush. It's not my favorite, but it's still a flat brush. This is an excellent example of a color or a hue that's going to be really transparent on the first layer. So what I'm gonna need to do for those hues is I'm gonna have to wait for this to dry, and then I'm going to do a second coat on top of it. A lot of times out of the tube, the red colors, the red hues, are pretty transparent, which again means you have to do more than one coat. A coat isn't a coat until it dries, so now I'm gonna wait for this to dry and then do another coat on top. Now this, you can kind of see how when I at the end finish off with very soft, barely touching this with the brush, how I'm getting rid of some of those brush strokes. That's the goal. So like here, you can still see a few of them. That's okay, as long as the attempt is as close to flat as possible. The other thing I should mention, and I'm trying to find the smaller wheel now so you can see this better. The other thing is that when you get into the violet part of the color wheel, I'll just use this one. Your blue violet, your red violet, and your violet. The key for me is not just that they match whatever's on here, and just as a side note, what you're seeing here is a bit different value color than what I have up here on this color wheel. So the key here is not just to match these, but to make them look different from one another. So they're blue violet, violet, and red violet, and oftentimes when people do their color wheels, those three colors end up looking the same. I had an example of a color wheel somewhere, but I don't know where I put it. So the task for you is to definitely distinguish between these colors that are pretty close to one another, okay? All right, so then once your swatch is dry, then you're going to use this little piece as a template. And for those of you who are at home, I attached this to the assignment sheet. Ideally, I would do this on the back, but right now this is wet. So you're gonna use this as a template, and you're going to trace it. I can't see it that well, but that's okay. You're gonna trace it, you're gonna cut it out with your X-Acto. So cut it out, and then take your, where you traced your template of the whole wheel, and you're going to glue it down. And so you're gonna do this for all 12 colors, filling the whole color wheel. It is important that you paste them in the order that you see them on the color wheel. So this order should be replicated. And when you glue them, use rubber cement. Do not use a glue stick, because you're gluing kind of a thicker material to another thicker material. So a glue stick isn't really going to work for this. You're going to have to use the rubber cement. So this is due next class. I'm gonna stop this recording now and